If you've ever wondered how it is that nothing ever seems to leave the planet's surface and come back towards it without America knowing both when it happened and what it is, the first steps of that were not made by America. They were made by Canada. Today we're going to talk about the only mass-produced aircraft native to the one place Geneva fears, the Canadian CF-100 Canuck, aka the Lead Sled, or more commonly, the Clunk. This well-performing plane was the largest fighter jet Canada ever built, and it formed the backbone of their contribution to the nuclear defense of North America. Despite its design being rapidly outpaced by the progress of jet-age tech, the skill of its pilots and the spirit of being a closeted rule-writing war tribe would let the Clunker keep up with its peers, both in America and across the pond. Because while the Maple Leaf straight-wing Starwalker may have only appeared as a world beater for a few years at most, for the design of plane that it was arguably the best. And what made the whole thing even more impressive was the fact that 5 years before the prototype took off, the industry needed to build it barely even existed in Canada at all. With the first deployments of jet aircraft in World War II, every country on the planet wanted a piece of the technological pie. America started working on the P-59 era Comet and the P-80 Shooting Star, the Soviet Union started researching how to make some because they didn't have the metallurgy to make them themselves, and the British and Germans were actively improving their jets already fielded in live combat. And in their corner of the Northern Hemisphere, Canada was also starting to lick their lips at that pie.
You got room for one more?
In January 1945, the Royal Canadian Air Force, or RCAF, issued a requirement known as Air Spec 7-1, demanding the acquisition of a new interceptor fighter capable of stopping high-flying bombers. However, Canada's kind of known for its harsh climate conditions most of the year, which suddenly makes a lot of sense that many of Geneva's rules were written by these guys in World War I, because you gotta be pretty wild to actively set up shop in a place where Mother Nature's default setting is death.
Go to hell.
Where do you think I come from?
And because of those extreme conditions, and a lot of their territory missing the sun for half the year, these aircraft would have to be held to standards that were very ahead of their time. Canada's new plane would have to fly rain, snow, or shine, have radar so it could fly with daylight or without it, and operate in ridiculous temperatures, anywhere between 45 and minus 57 Celsius or 113 to minus 70 Fahrenheit. Then there was actually meeting the bombers, because, well, it's rude to leave a girl waiting. Naturally, the boys are going to want a fast ride, so the plane would have to climb like they meant it and reach up to Mach 0.85 when they got there, which pretty much required a pair of jet engines. And while good things never last, you still want to hang out for as long as possible, so the new jet would need to make a 750-mile or 1,200-knot-mile trip and still have enough time left over for a solid 15 minutes of climactic fun at the end of the day's events. However, there was one really big problem. Canada didn't have any privatized infrastructure to build the plane in, and they had barely started making the jet engine they would fly this thing with. After observing Frank Whittle's Power Jet's W1X engine in 1943, they had taken some steps towards making their own jet engine, including a small government-owned company called Turbo Research Limited. But at the time of the requirement, they were still trying to make a working model, and producing the aircraft would be a completely separate matter. To make such a plane at scale would require dedicating a pretty big factory. But thankfully, the Canadians had quite a few thanks in part to the British.
Tally-ho!
When the Germans started sweeping through Europe, Britain realized they did not have the manufacturing power to really keep pace with the Germans on their own. Luckily for them, they weren't on their own, and they could call for help from the group of nations known then as the British Commonwealth. Back in the early 1900s, Britain had begun to loosen its grip on a lot of its older colonies, with a major step being taken in 1926 when the Balfour Declaration stated that Britain and its dominions were equal in all spheres, but commonly loyal to the British Crown. This shift in Britain's international approach evolved a step further in 1931 by way of the Statute of Westminster, which granted Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa full governmental control of their own area in exchange for their continued loyalty. Basically, they walked up to them and said, "Gentlemen, chaps, friends, we're getting real tired of all these independence days and revolutions, plus that Great Depression is just the worst. We cannot afford to fight all of you right now. So we'll make you a deal. You promise to stay loyal to us, we'll just give you full control of your country, and we'll all be friends. We don't need to spend money on you, you can make your own decisions, decisions, everything will be just peachy.
Damn good deal.
Canada would respond with something to the effect of, sure thing there, bud, and under that 1931 statute, they would gain their first taste of true national independence as part of that new British Commonwealth. It wasn't complete independence. The Brits could still toggle the admin settings for the Canadian Constitution until 1982 when they made their own constitution and revoked the British access, but it was about 99% of the way there. And it was that continued loyalty to the British Crown, and the British Prime Minister at the time actually trying to keep his campaign promise of no foreign conscription, is what led them to volunteer a ton of their real estate for manufacturing and training of British troops and equipment starting on December 17, 1939, under the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, or the Plan. This massive upscaling of Canadian industry would require a lot of civilian contributions, including a car factory that was nationalized and converted into a bomber production plant called the Victory Aircraft Plant, which would build Lancaster, York, and Lincoln bombers designed by the British company Avro, which was typically marketed as Avro. Fast forward to the war's end, and Canada no longer needs this aircraft plant because the war's over. They don't need the bombers anymore. But they don't want to just throw the factory away either, because the war has given Canada this massive domestic aviation industry. That's jobs, that's skills, that's sheer economic value. And just getting rid of it would dent the entire country. It would be better if they could sell it off and privatize it so it could still be useful without costing tax dollars.
I smell an opportunity.
Enter two guys by the names of Roy Dobson and Fred Smythe. Dobson was the managing director of Avro, and Smythe was the production director at the Victory plant. And I don't actually know whether this was their idea or if the Canadian government reached out to them, but one way or another, these two gentlemen met and also decided that the preservation of Canada's aviation industry was a good idea, and they came up with a plan. Effectively, Dobson and Smythe decided to open a Canadian branch of the Avro company called Avro Canada, using a portion of the Victory plant. But life never goes according to plan, and in this case, that worked out really well, because after a couple days of negotiations, they walked away with not a part of the plant, but the entire plant. The new Avro Canada would officially take over the plant on December 1st, 1945, and factory workers were initially tasked with what they called bread and butter work to keep the factory from going out of business while they figured out what they were going to do next. And luckily for them, there just so happened to be a government contract out and about for a new jet fighter, so they took the challenge. In October 1946, Avro Canada would receive that contract and officially start work on what they called the XC-100. While they were working on that, Turbo Research Limited, that jet engine program the Canadian government was still cooking like poutine in the background, had finally pulled its signature dish off the stove. The first Canadian jet engine had been made, a 2,400-pound or 10.7 kilonewton turbojet called the Canuck. No, not that one, this one. And unlike many nations that had started with centrifugal flow engines, which would compress the air for making thrust by using redirection and shrinking pipes, Canada had skipped straight to the axial flow engine, which just Uno reverse cards the air and uses its properties against itself to produce the same aerodynamic plowing. The Canuck engine ran its first successful test on August 17, 1948, and I'm assuming it was word of that success that reached the ears of Dobson and Avro Canada, because when Dobson heard about the program, he offered to buy it off the Canadian government's hands as well, and that was one less thing the government had to collect taxes for, so they were on board pretty quick.
Whose car are we gonna take?
The Department of National Defense, or D&D, would also use that success as an opportunity to request a more usable engine, and set a requirement to make an engine capable of shafting the sky with 6,500 pounds or 29 kilonewtons of thrust. And Canada, being the mad lads that they are, developed that improved engine in less than a year. The new Orenda engine series was run on the bench for the first time on February 10, 1949, the same year that Avro submitted their fully built CF-100 Mark I prototype to the RCAF, and the same year that Canada joined NATO. However, just because they ran on the bench doesn't mean they'll run in a plane, and the Orenda engines weren't actually ready to be put in the prototype yet. So when the first of two Mark I prototypes flew on January 19, 1950, Avro was running on borrowed British Rolls-Royce Avon RA3s, which put out about the same thrust the Orendas were originally going to. This aircraft, painted glossy black with white lightning racing stripes, was carrying a very light fuel load, probably to reduce the severity of any given fire fire, and left the ground at only 1,500 feet or 460 meters. The flight in general also implied that the plane was a great success, even before fitting the Canadian engines. So combined with their new NATO defense obligations and the Korean War kicking off in June, the Canadian government really wanted to push this idea through into service, and in September 1950, the RCAF would order 124 CF-100s from Avro at a delivery rate of 5 a month starting in 1953.
Shut up and take my money!
In the meantime, the Orenda engines were going through their aerial testing stages with the help of the red, white, and blue next door. And the Air Force, in their standard early Cold War bureaucratic bullshit, decided that, probably without thinking very hard, the best plane to test it on was a single-engined F-86. They would modify one of these into the F-86J and start testing it in October 1950. But, probably sensing disaster, Roy Dobson from Avro Canada would swing in from left field and say, "Hey there, you and I both know that jet engine tech is still pretty unreliable. What if that one engineer fails, huh? How about we take it down a notch, bring the brain cells back, and stick it in a plane with more than one engine instead?" So they took an old Lancaster bomber and bolted on 2 Orendas, one on each side, which proved to be a really smart decision because one of those engines later failed on the ground, and had that been the Sabre in the air, the fallout from the crash could have canceled the entire program. Once they got it running fine on the Lancaster, then it was time to test it back on the Sabre, and following an order for more and improved variants at a faster delivery rate in February 1951, by June 20th that year, the Canuck would reach the evolutionary stage of becoming an all-Canadian design, because on that day, the Canuck would take flight for the first time as the CF-100 Mark II with the Orenda engines. They were still new, and the test pilot reported that only at high altitudes did they show even the slightest difference from the Avons, but they were Canadian.
We're doing this one my way.
10 of these Mark IIs would become the pre-production versions of the service-ready Canucks, eventually becoming either Mark III-T trainer variants or prototypes for newer versions. Right off the bat, it also started picking up nicknames from both its pilots and others. The noise the front landing gear made as it retracted into its well after takeoff earned it the nickname the Clunk, while its massive size and lesser agility gave it the nickname Lead Sled by CL-13 Sabre pilots, alongside lesser-known or less verifiable others such as the CF-0, the Zilch, and the Beast. But that last one in particular was pretty accurate because this plane would prove to be a lot to handle at first. The first model sent into active service was the CF-100 Mark III, first flown on October 11, 1952 and sent into service in 1953. Many of its stats would stay within the same rough ballpark throughout its service life, such as straight wings, the empty weight of roughly 23,000 pounds or 10,500 kilos, and a max weight of roughly 33,000 pounds or 15,000 kilos. However, the Mark III would only set the starting point of speed and range stats that all future models would improve on. Those sources tend to be really inconsistent on some of the details. From what I can gather, the Mark III Canucks kicked off the series with a pretty strong hustle and bustle for straight-wing jets, with starting stats like a max speed of about 600 miles an hour or 965 metric knot miles an hour, a cruising speed upwards of 460 miles or 740 knot miles an hour, and a 2,000 mile or 3,200 knot mile max range on just internal fuel. That internal dyno juice totaled up to 1,552 gallons or just shy of 5,900 liters, and bolting on a pair of wing tanks onto the ends would snap that total up to 2,248 gallons or just over 8,500 liters. And all of that was Canadian made. In fact, the only things that weren't were the fire control, the radar, and the guns. The Canucks borrowed the same APG-33 radar and Hughes E1 fire control system as the F-89A Scorpion, but the guns were a little harder to come by. They were originally planned as British 30 mils, then tried to be set as 20 mils, but in the end, the only gun that worked out was a 50 cal, and the Canadian approach to mounting the 50 cals was actually brilliant. Instead of physically building them into the frame where you'd have to carefully feed a belt into place one at a time to reload them, Avro gave the entire plane what was essentially a fanny pack filled with 8 50 cals and 200 rounds apiece, which meant that instead of having to reload each individual gun after the plane landed, the crew could just drop the old one, bolt on a fresh one, turn it around, and send it back out there with one of the fastest pit stops you've ever seen. I really hope that Canada had at least one competition to see how fast they could NASCAR that shit off the tarmac, and they probably did because we do know they could hot swap that fanny pack in as little as 7 minutes. These Mark IIIs would be built in 3 different versions: 9 Mark IIIAs with 6,000-pound Orenda 2 engines, 11 Mark III CT trainers, and 50 Mark IIIBs with Orenda 8s, which put out the same thrust as the 2s but were way more reliable. However, that only totals up to 70, despite the fact that they ordered 124, because because in 1954, the rest of them were canceled and reordered as the next model, the Mark IVs. And they did that because the Mark III was kind of a disaster. For starters, the gun pack we just mentioned wasn't as up to snuff as it looked. While crews could change them out in 7 minutes in the summer, wearing gloves tends to make you fumble around like you're wearing an astronaut suit, and in the winter, that same process would take half an hour. The fanny packs also came with a bunch of kinks, some you could finagle and some you couldn't. The Canadians had to be careful of faulty rounds, which could splinter and cause the engine to suck the bullet fragments into the engine like Kirby. And they also had to fix the nosewheel bay door, which in one test vibrated itself loose and opened up just enough to get caught by the lead fire hose pouring out the front. But they never could fix the guns themselves, which would jam in the cold Canadian climates and produce more exhaust gas from the propellant than they could vent, limiting gun bursts to a max of 3 seconds. Now, 3 seconds might be an eternity for machine gun fire, but let's be honest here, the patron saint of hole punching didn't make Medusa to not madump you, so that still defeats the point. Add that to the 50 cals not having enough punch to lights out a bomber, and the fact that the 23mm on the Soviet not B-29s outranged them, and the guns proved to be such a handicap that the Mark III was pretty much restricted to operational training.
Hey, Tiny, you gonna clean his windshield?
But the plane itself also had a laundry list of its own problems. Aside from the landing gear being unreliable and having no nose-wheel steering, the fuel system was complicated, also unreliable, and had to be managed manually, despite the fact that using the control panel for that was, to rephrase the words of Not a Pound for Air to Ground, like trying to fly a fucking nuclear power plant. The flight stick was originally put directly between the pilot's eyeballs and his compass, and smoothly navigating the cockpit was always more of an expert tier skill. Then there were the engines. The early models had a habit of cracking their compressor blades, and the all-weather part didn't check out at first, because the engine casing would noticeably shrink under cooler weather as simple as the rain, which would make it and the turbine blades try to share a room, and turbine blades don't like to share. And as the engineers found out after they'd already built the thing, somebody goofed the blueprints so hard they put the engines in the wrong place. When they originally concepted this thing, Avro had planned for the engines to be out in the middle of the wings. However, they decided it would be structurally easier if they just moved them up and against the fuselage and rested them on the wing box. However, I'm guessing that whoever drew the blueprints either screwed up the math or read the numbers wrong, because the engines were both too high up and too far forwards. This pushed the center of mass further forward than it was supposed to be, and twisted the wings along the chord, or the imaginary line, from front to back, subsequently cracking the front wing spar said engines were mounted to. And when Avro found out about the problem, their response was, no big deal, and they put a band-aid fix on it. All they did was bolt on some plates to thicken the front end and call it done, because otherwise they'd have to redesign the entire wing box, which is the literal cornerstone of any airplane structure, which could take years and risk the entire program being cancelled due to Canada's tight timelines. But as you might have guessed, that didn't work, and after losing 2 of the pre-production models in major airshow crashes, Avro couldn't hide under the table anymore and finally had to face the music.
It's your turn.
Luckily for them, one of their engineers managed to find an actual fix in January 1952, 2 years after the prototype flew, by reinforcing the spar at the problem point and changing the connection, so they didn't need to change the wing box. Unluckily for them, however, the sheer volume of errors and issues, combined with another crash that had occurred because the pilots wore through their oxygen masks because the company just didn't buy more, reeked so badly of negligence that the Canadian government was about ready to dust off the checklist just to clean their own company out. On top of that, the pre-production deliveries that were happening by this point were such a complete mess that 2 planes rarely flew exactly the same, and many of them didn't even break the same. There was even one case where a new plane came in and the intake inspection found a screw on the upper wing surface literally held in place by a piece of chewing gum. Building an entire sector of the military aviation industry and a plane to go with it in 5 years may be impressive, but so is the list of problems that comes from the inspired rush job. And in 1952, Avro would receive a notice from the Canadian government ordering the indefinite suspension of Canuck production.
It's time to stop!
However, the Clunk was still easier to fly and cost $300,000 less to buy per unit than the similar American F-89 Scorpion in 1950s money, or $4 million today. So they either doubled back on that decision quickly, or Avro just didn't care, because they kept making the CF-100s anyways, fixed all the problems, and made the first truly serviceable version, the Mark IV. The Mark IV's prototype would first see the sky on October 11, 1952 as a modified Mark II platform, and 2 months later on December 18th, the Canuck would get itself an early Christmas present. Avro's test pilot would put the CF-100 Mark IV prototype into a controlled and recovered supersonic dive from high altitude during a test flight, becoming the first straight-winged, jet-propelled fighter in the world to break the sound barrier. These Mark IVs, later relabeled the Mark IVAs, were first rolled out in September 1953, and would come with several upgrades over the 3s, including keeping pace with the F-89's radar developments and now sporting the D model's APG-40 radar and the Hughes MG-2 fire control system. The new tech let it punch incoming aircraft square in the face or cut off their drive-by with its new primary weapon, the folding fin aerial rockets. Avro had originally played with putting 48 of them in a deployable flash drive on the belly behind the gun pack, but this caused vibrations so bad that it crashed the Mark IV prototype on August 23, 1954, killing the backseater and forcing the company to replace the wingtip fuel tanks with two 29 rocket pods. And while the RCAF had planned to do away with a single bomber within 60 shots, the pilots probably would have been able to take out multiple bombers with a single rocket load, considering they would practice hitting targets with only 3 rockets per side. They still kept the machine gun pack as a backup though, which was always nice to have, especially in case somebody forgot to arm the rocket pods on the ground and left the pilot without their primary weapon.
God damn it! I'm gonna do this the old-fashioned way.
However, that was the limit of the clunker's firepower. Avro did test carrying up to 4,000-pound bombs on another of the Mark IIs in 1954, because, slinging 58 bottles of exploding maple syrup at a bomber wasn't Canadian enough, so of course they're gonna stick on the exploding cans. But due to G limits and those wing structure worries, they ruled it as unsafe and ditched the idea. But even without the bombs, these new weapons, combined with the performance boost from the new 6,500-pound thrust Arenda 9 engines, led the U.S. Air Force to recognize it as the most potent interceptor of its immediate time. 147 Mark IVAs were built, with the remaining 144 Mark IVs getting the Arenda 11 engines with 7,400 pounds of thrust and the relabeling the Mark IVBs. And it was during the production of the Mark IVs that they were actually named, with the Canadian population electing for the name Canuck by popular vote after the JN-4 Canuck trainer aircraft from the First World War. But without a doubt, the most famous Canuck version is the Mark V, of which 329 were built, starting with the prototype that flew in September 1954. The first production model flew on October 12th the next year, and by December of 1956 it was all the way in service. This model was arguably the best at the interceptor mission, and in particular it was better at reaching high altitudes, because the only thing scarier than a Canadian pilot is a Canadian pilot with an altitude advantage.
It's a good thing I brought some backup.
The Mark V Canucks came with extensions to the wings and horizontal tails to let it reach further up in the sky than before. This increased the Canucks' practical max altitude from 45,000 feet to 50,000 feet, and in the words of the test pilot, the Mark V could do at 45,000 feet what the Mark IV could do at 39,000. It did come with a drawback though. Longer wings without stronger wings means lower G loads, and the new 5s could only pull 5 Gs instead of 7.5. But for some reason, possibly Avro's history of negligence coming back one more time, the pilots weren't informed of that, and 2 more major crashes happened because of it, with one of the pilots pulling a 7.3 G turn during an air show that ripped both wings off the plane. That got added to the safety brief, and the newer Arenda 14 engines with 7,500 pounds of thrust got added to the latest clunks. But they also lost something, that being the machine gun pack. The list of problems with the guns had never been fixed, and in the age of faster jet bombers, the already meager and problematic 50 cals pretty much only existed to make the aircraft carrying them apologize for being in the bomber's airspace. And if the Canadians are packing heat, they are not there to be sorry about it.
That's your job.
But with the ultimate Canuck now flying, the Canadians were done playing around with their own tech, because with 9 full Canuck squadrons at their peak, now it was time to play around with everyone else's. Starting in September 1955, the CF-100s would start making themselves known across the pond, becoming the first Canadian-designed and manufactured jets, civilian or military, to cross the Atlantic Ocean, when 3 Mark IVBs performed at the Farnborough Air Show in the United Kingdom. After that, the Canadians would take up a more long-term residence in Europe in 1956, when Canada participated in the Nimble Bat program and sent 4 of their Clunk squadrons over to serve with NATO for the next 6 years. While America would catch up quickly over the next few years with multiple different platforms, the CF-100 started out as the only interceptor in NATO with all-weather capability. But they definitely weren't the only planes in the sky, and that turned into a lot of unscheduled events. While the nations of NATO were a unified force against the Soviets, most of the time there wasn't a whole lot to do, and fighter pilots, being the macho, cocky guys they typically are usually never satisfied if they're not proving they're better than their peers, and they're like that no matter which country you come from. So at least throughout the early days of NATO, different national air forces would challenge other air forces to unofficial dogfighting duels, usually with little warning, and whoever got caught on the gun camera first lost, and probably owed somebody a drink.
Here you go.
Thank you. Much appreciated, Pops.
However, the majority of these guys very quickly learned why you never want a Canadian to give you their undivided attention, because between the straight wings on the Canuck and the balls of their pilots, many European players would find themselves getting owned by these maple-sipping drivers, especially after a few pro tips they got from the Canadair Sabre squadrons the Clunks replaced. In fact, the main player that the CF-100s had trouble fighting was the Sabre, which would usually kick the Clunkers' ass, except against the one absolute madman who pulled up into a hard climb, actually split his throttles like Top Gun had somehow been invented yet, came back down on the guy and put him square in the crosshairs.
Splitting the throttles? Coming around.
This is like that one time that one of my Twitch viewers came in and told me about how he knew a QF-4 drone operator that an F-16 pilot was talking shit to, who then proceeded to show the Viper driver the receiving end of an ass whooping when he found out the Phantom can in fact outfly it when there isn't a meat bag in the cockpit. The bar tab that must have gotten paid out to that clunk driver to make sure that story never got to the ears of his peers must have been legendary. However, the Canadians usually stood by their brothers in the European skies, and domestic duels weren't a massive problem. It was everyone else they had to usually be worried about. They would also come across planes like the F-84 F Thunderstreaks and F-100 Super Sabres, but pilots all across NATO would usually leave them alone because they turned like a sack of wet bricks. Beating them in a dogfight was like kicking a puppy. It's cruel and hardly a bragging right. So the only other targets that these duels would usually break out with were the other more sporty targets, the Hawker Hunters and the Dassault Mystères. For the Hunters, the Canucks would actually start by allowing the Hunters to get behind them. Then at the last minute, they would slam the nose over into a power dive, cut throttle, and pop the air brakes. While the Hunter was agile, its air brakes were too small to cut its speed as fast as the Canuck could, and it would overshoot the clunker, get caught, and then deafen some poor sap on the ground with the sound barrier breakage he had on the way out of the dive. But the Clunks absolutely loved fighting the French, because, while there's no nice way to say it, it was seal clubbing. At the end of a steep climb or dive, the French Mystères would suffer the same kind of wing drop spin-out stall that the MiG-15s had in hard turns, and recovery was just as uncertain. So if the Canuck pulled that move, the French just wouldn't follow them, and Canadians would actually double down on this by seeking out French Mystères that had just taken off, were full of fuel, and could climb even less well before slashing past them and buzzing the towers at their airfield, which on one hand is absolutely hilarious and easily the world's fastest game of capture the flag, but at the same time they're also bragging about spawn camping, so I mean, come on.
A lot of fun. Catch you next time.
Back on the main continent, though, the Canucks would still keep up the performance record, especially after they were integrated into the North American Aerospace Defense Program, or NORAD, in 1957. Despite definitely being an obsolete straight-wing design by this point, with American planes coming into service like the F-101 Voodoo, the F-101 and 106 Delta Darts and Daggers, and the Navy F-8 Crusaders, the Canadians still acquitted themselves well in NORAD's various exercises. During the October 1961 Sky Shield exercise, they had the highest simulated kill-to-loss ratio of any NORAD interceptor, although the true representation of those numbers may have been a bit altered by the targets those pilots were actually able to go after. For example, CF-100 pilots wouldn't go after the B-57s because they could straight up outrun the Clanks entirely, but the fact that these aircraft kept up as well as they did at all was still very worthy of note.
Finally, a worthy opponent. Our battle will be legendary!
But without a doubt, one of the most important and, in my opinion, understated contributions of the CF-100 was how it helped America figure out how to detect incoming nukes. Between January 8, 1960 and the spring of 1964, CF-100s would help the USA with a little program called Operation Lookout. By the late 1950s, the US and the USSR were both studying means of detecting incoming ICBMs to make the threat of mutually assured destruction less of a deterrent and more of a suggestion. And if you want to stop incoming nukes, you need to know what to look for. So in order to know what they're looking for, America figured that the best way was to test launch their own nukes and have a plane with various sensors on board chase the nuke.
What do you think of this?
Yeah, that's it, kid.
What?
And to make this happen, the US Department of Defense's precursor to DARPA decided to invite Canada, because this is an insane task and that's exactly the kind of shit Canada's into. But in reality, not only was Canada in NORAD, making this kind of pertinent to them, but the Canadian D&D's Canadian Armaments and Research Development Establishment, or CARD, was already using weather balloons and infrared or IR cameras to analyze the composition of the atmosphere. Which doesn't sound like much more than nerd speak at first, but here's the thing. If you want to figure out what isn't supposed to be in that section of the air, first you need to know what that section of the air is supposed to look like. By having the heat signatures of the atmosphere and measuring the exact frequencies of the heat signature of both egress and re-entry of similar projectiles, you have the basic math equation of signal minus noise that you need to pick out disturbances in pretty much anything. Only with that filter in hand could the US then track the difference in flight path between a nuclear weapon and a civilian satellite. So Canada has the atmospheric scanning, aka the noise half of the equation, and America has the nukes, aka the signal half. Long story short, all you need to know is that the Geneva checklist and the defense budget big enough to fight God are about to team up, and with their powers combined, they're gonna know everything you so much as think about putting in their sky. But there was one more reason why they invited Canada. America had moved so quickly towards faster planes, they didn't have anything with both the altitude and the loiter time to capture this data other than the U-2 spy plane. And all the U-2s were busy playing Where's Waldo with all the Soviet stuff. Plus, these tests were being made to calibrate the onboard sensors of the U-2, so they could run around and say, I spy with my little eye a f***ing nuke, start running.
Run for your lives! Everyone run for cover!
So they not only needed a platform that could reach the altitudes required, but also cheaply and easily mount a payload that could look up without being blocked by the pylon it was mounted to, aka a wingtip hardpoint. So the only plane in service in all of North America that could actually fulfill every aspect of that nuke-chasing mission was the Canadian CF-100. Depending on your source, 2 or 3 CF-100 Mark IV-Bs were flown out to work with US units and fitted with IR sensor pods on their wingtips. These aircraft were then sent first to Ascension Island, the same place the Brits would later use as a base in the Falklands War, and later Patrick Air Force Base in Florida.
No, this is Patrick.
These planes would fly up to around 40,000 feet and chase various missile launches to gather data on the heat signatures caused by ballistic missiles re-entering Earth's atmosphere, as well as the heat signature of the exhaust plumes when they took off. And just so we're clear, I would like to stop for a moment and emphasize just how Canadian this whole thing is. These are straight-winged aircraft that can only break the sound barrier if they are explicitly trying to, and they are being tasked with chasing down a goddamn ballistic missile going Mach fuck to record its heat signature on the way out and the way in. This is a whole new level of aggression, and it's being used entirely to hold the camera and yell World Star in front of an incoming nuke. The Canadian clunkers would record the heat signatures of both egress and ingress on well over 150 missile launches between 1960 and 1964 on a long list of missiles. These missiles included the US Air Force Thor Intermediate Range Ballistic Missiles, or IRBMs, Minuteman, Atlas, and Titan Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles, or ICBMs, and the US Navy's Polaris Submarine-Launched Ballistic Missiles, or SLBMs, on top of tracking satellite launches of terrestrial satellites like Telstar and Tyros, and interplanetary explorers like Ranger and Mariner. And even while they were doing that, they were still managing to complete side quests. For one thing, there was a CF-100 on station on February 20th, 1962, observing the Friendship 7 space mission, where the US finally put astronaut John Glenn in orbit for America's first manned orbital spaceflight, completing the side quest known as
Now watch this drive.
Then they would complete a second side quest titled A Favor to NASA when they tested the IR scanner used on the Nimbus weather satellite. But sadly, all good things must come to an end, and while the Canadian Canucks performed well, they were still being rapidly outpaced by the technology of the time, and that meant their days were numbered. By 1961, the RCAF was having to come to terms with the fact that the Canucks simply did not have the performance to keep up with aircraft in the 1960s era of the jet age. Sadly, the biggest problem with the CF-100 itself was that it was born into an era of such rapid advances in aircraft technology that planes could be considered obsolete within a year. And to some degree, the RCAF was aware of that from the moment it came off the production line. Unfortunately for Canada, however, the Canucks swept-wing variant known as the CF-103 hadn't progressed beyond the mock-up stage in 1951. 1951, and the Arrow itself was mysteriously cancelled in 1959, which is a whole separate can of worms I plan to unpack in full very soon. So between 1961 and 1962, the Canuck would be removed and retired from fighter duty and replaced with the CF-101 Voodoo domestically and the CF-104 Starfighters abroad, both of which were Canadian versions of the American Century Series interceptors. But that didn't mean the Canuck was done.
When your planet is in ashes, then you have my permission to die.
The two-seat nature of the Canuck gave it room for a lot of flexibility in its purpose, and by the mid-1950s, several Mark Vs were modified into dedicated electronic countermeasures variants known as the Mark V-Cs, a designation that was formally established in April of 1959. These aircraft were Mark Vs modified for hitting the enemy with enough electronic confusion to make Storm from the X-Men jealous, and the bomb hardpoints the Canadians tested in 1954 came in handy here. If they can handle a 1,000-pound bomb, they can handle a chaff pod, so these planes would walk into the battlefield like MC Hammer because their entire MO was, can't touch this. With the chaff pod slung under wing and an electronic jammer in the ass end, these planes would serve well as electronic aggressors to confuse the ever-living crap out of American radars in the various NORAD nuclear interception exercises that would be run over the years. In fact, the Canucks did so well that their assistance in these training runs allowed Strategic Air Command bombers to perform simulated nukings of American cities as far south as Savannah, Georgia. Later, these Mark V-Cs and other Mark Vs on the retirement list were updated into the Mark V-Ds, a more committed electronic warfare plane married to an updated jamming suite to make their exercise dance partners that much more miserable. However, one thing the Canuck was smart enough to never put a ring on was its armament, and some Mark Vs would later be modified into different missile-firing variants known as the Mark V-Ms. Some of these would carry the indigenous Canadian Velvet Glove missiles, but with the advent of the Sparrow missiles, the Canadian clunkers would focus on trying out that tech alongside other ideas, like an afterburning version of the Canadian Orenda engines. While other missiles were thought about, like the Falcons, the Sidewinders, and even the Genie nuclear rockets, none of these ever came to fruition. The Mark VI variant these upgrades were proposed for would never see the light of day, as they were cancelled in favor of the Arrow that mysteriously disappeared from Canada's plans.
And for my next trick, I will make my career disappear.
However, Canada wouldn't be the only place the Canuck would leave its mark. Belgium had also been looking for an all-weather replacement for their aging British Gloucester Meteors, and on July 28, 1957, the European capital of chocolate would announce the Canuck as the victor, defeating the Gloucester Javelin, the SO-4050 Vautour 2N, the Saab J-32 Lanson, the North American F-86K Sabre, and the Northrop F-89D Scorpion. The Belgians would order 54 of the maple syrup slingers, with the first batch of 15 aircraft received in December 1957. Unfortunately, only 53 of those planes would be delivered. One of them broke like an expensive Lego set on the way over, but the last one was in Belgian hands by July of 1958. Their service life would be uneventful. And by 1964, the Belgian clunkers had also been retired in favor of newer starfighters. By the end of its service life, all of 692 CF-100 Canucks had been built, and a few of them saw some special responsibilities here and there. In 1967, one clunker was loaned to United Aircraft of Canada, later the Canadian branch of Pratt & Whitney, to ratchet strap a nutsack to itself for the explicit purpose of testing the JT-15D bizjet turbofan engine, technically making it the only 3-engine clunker to serve. A little later, in 1975, a Mark V clunker was converted to a recon version, given multiple different cameras and IR sensors until it could see you like the Predator, and it was used for recon missions until it was retired in 1975. However, even this version of the Canadian craft couldn't last forever, and by October 1981, the last of the straight-wing CF-100 fleet was fully retired from military service after 31 years, and the triple-engine testbed clunker would finally retire on June 28, 1982, at last marking the end of the Canucks' service to the world. Sadly, all Belgian CF-100s would be scrapped, but 30 of the Canadian CF-100s would make it into museums in Belgium, Canada, the United States, and the UK, several of which would be repainted to resemble the original prototype's paint scheme. But while that ends the story of the clunk, one thing we should definitely take away from it is the phrase, never underestimate Canada. Whether it's their time in the trenches or their time in the skies, even if Canada only has a short window to shine, they will absolutely make it count. And you'd better hope to God you're not in their way when they do. Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.